Doctor of Theology, Associate Scholar at the Department of History at Harvard University, and postdoctoral researcher at the University of Helsinki in Finland. Petra will also be one of our panelists today. Thank you so much, Petra, for joining us today and to put this program together. I'm pleased to now introduce you to the rest of the panel members. We have today Margaret Crahan, a senior research scholar and director of the Cuban program at the Institute of Latin American Studies at Columbia University. Maha Marouan, visiting scholar, Weatherhead Scholar Program at Harvard University, Associate Professor, Department of Women, Gender and Sexuality Studies and African Studies Program at the Pennsylvania State University, and Mabel Cuesta, U.S. Latino and Spanish Caribbean Literature Professor at the University of Houston, Texas. This panel will discuss the role of religion in Cuban society on the 21st century. It will provide an overview of the political, economic, and social development in Cuba in recent years, asking how religion either contributes to or disrupts such processes of social change. The panelists will discuss themes such as religion as a social force, gender and religion agency, and religious charity, the lived experience of a LGBTQ plus religious community on the island, and the nexus of santería, tourism, and commercial religion. Thank you for accepting our invitation to all our panelists. Before I hand the word to you, I have a few housekeeping items I have to cover. Please notice that there is a simultaneous interpretation available in English and Spanish. To enable interpretation, please click on the interpretation button, which has a globe icon at the bottom of your Zoom window, and select your preferred language. To hear the original speaker, you just leave it in off. Ahora voy a decirlo en español. Hay una interpretación simultánea disponible al inglés y al español. Para habilitar esta interpretación, haga clic en el botón de interpretación, que básicamente es un icono con la forma del globo terráqueo.
Icon, and choose the language of preference, whether it's English or Spanish, or leave it off if you rather listen to the original audio.
During today's presentation, the chat function but if you have any question for our speakers, please feel free to send them through the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. We'll be answering questions at the end of the session, and feel free to submit it at any time. So without any further ado, I'd like to ask Dr. Margaret Crahan to start with her presentation. Thank you so much, Margaret, to be with us today.
Thank you, and thank you to particularly the individuals who led the organization of this very interesting webinar, both Petra, Kuivala, and Jimena Colmena. I am delighted to be here. I just want to mention that I have disregarded the guidelines normally given to people using PowerPoint. Rather than having data points, I took nuggets from the paper that I wrote for this webinar and am going to share them with the audience. I will begin with the traditional definition of civil society. That is, it is commonly defined as the realm of associational life that includes both organized and informal sectors, in which is other than the state and the market. In Cuba, civil society is characterized by ambiguities in terms of the limits of the state and the non-state sectors. The informal economy, for example, may be considered part of civil society, together with those networks that cross the state, semi-state, and non-state boundaries. The effectivity of any civil society resides in part in the extent of horizontal links among associations, as well as the existence of vertical links with governmental officials, together with leverage constituted by the degree of associational cooperation and trust and the capacity to mobilize on a mass basis. For Cuba, a more accurate definition of civil society is that it is composed of those sectors that discharge the usual functions of civil society, including pressuring the government for the efficient delivery of state services, which today, as you know, is a major issue. Accountability on the part of the government, transparency on the part of the government, and the provision of citizen and human security. For example, facilitating access to the requirements for life with dignity, including adequate nutrition, healthcare, housing, education, and other items. The complexities of Cuban civil society include the necessity of citizen organizations must be under the supervision of state agencies, and many comply. However, a closer look at the associational sphere in the country reveals a high degree of complexity along a continuum that ranges from fully autonomous groups with or without government licenses through state-initiated organizations that operate somewhat autonomously, but not entirely, and government mass organizations that contain within them some sectors that generate counter discourses to those of the state. In terms of political attitudes and behavior, the spectrum ranges from sharp opposition to the government and Cuban socialism through critics of the government, but not necessarily of socialism, to dissidents within not only the state's mass organizations, but also within the government bureaucracy, as well as to those sectors that support the government strongly, which have diminished substantially in recent years. Cuban civil society, therefore, can be said to incorporate opponents to the present government, dissident groups that range along reformist spectrums, together with critical and heterodox individuals within the state who participate in civil society networks, non-state civil society networks. Given the increasing level of articulation of alternative discourses to the states, it is not surprising that a growing number of organizations have carved out a certain degree of autonomy from the government, which allows them to function as a source of new ideas, debate, and citizen action. Conceptually speaking, these associations contribute to an expanding public sphere in Cuba, contrary to the expectation that the circulation of discourses is essentially determined to the state. In short, you have many more voices offering opinions and options today than previously. This chart shows you the state organizations. As I've mentioned, for example, some mass organizations, for example, the Cuban Confederation of Workers, Cuban Confederation of Women, are increasing offering discourses that are critical of the government. In terms of my topic, I am contextualizing primarily institutional religions and to a lesser degree, faith-based groups and networks. It is important to realize that the identification of the Cuban state with sovereignty gives it an important source of power to stimulate nationalism. This is especially true in terms of the defensive project of the state with respect to the historical hostility of the US towards the revolutionary regime, which many Cubans, including dissidents, identify as a threat to Cuban sovereignty. Religious groups have also repeatedly warned against outside intervention in Cuba. Beyond domestic realities, Cuba, the global criticism of intervention in Cuba is, as you know, from the UN votes, substantial. In addition, there is an argument that it is not accurate to pose a clear-cut division between civil society and the dominant state project. Sectors of civil society with the potential to generate spaces of legitimate action are not necessarily opposed to the socialist model, although they may support extensive criticisms. In addition, while horizontal links within civil society are still limited in Cuba, there is a complex set of networks that connect civil society and the state, creating a scenario that cannot be reduced to a civil society model that is absolutely against the state. High levels of discontent over current economic conditions in Cuba has not led to a mass movement, although there are episodic expressions of discontent in the streets, but rather a multiple public space in which you're getting competing discourses from the state as well as from civil society sectors. The competition for public space is increasing, as I indicated, and various associations are occupying new spaces outside government control and gradually reshaping the everyday experience of state-citizen and citizen-citizen interaction. There has been a ceding of public space by the government, particularly as it is less capable of meeting its citizens' needs, the assumption of greater autonomy by some official organizations, the expansion of informal and formal networks, and a revitalization of some historic civil organizations. The result is obviously increased ferment as such groups attempt to exert even greater influence over politics and society. A principal objective is to secure greater enjoyment of socioeconomic rights and freedom from want in the context of greater political participation. While widespread societal discontent and hence pressure on the government exists, it has not been transformed into integrated civil society mobilization. Nevertheless, there clearly is a growing level of organization and pressure on the government to respond more effectively to citizen needs, although a critical mass does not appear to have been mobilized yet. A question: what roles have religion, particularly institutional religions, played in the ongoing evolution of civil society in Cuba? They have, for example, assumed greater roles in providing for basic needs. For example, foodstuffs, medical supplies, educational and cultural activities. This has given some religions greater influence in public debates and Cuba public visibility. The Catholic Church and the Archdiocese of Havana, particularly under Cardinal Ortega, used the opportunities for greater occupation of public space through its publications and its organizations. Religions have also negotiated some resolution of political issues. For example, the release of political prisoners. Again, something in which the Catholic Archbishop of Havana was also active and increased access to public space, education, cultural life, and the media. But none of the institutional religions have generated, led, or supported a national mass movement with a consensual agenda and agreed upon leadership. I'm going to conclude with impediments to religion taking a larger opportunity to occupy a leadership role within the evolving civil society in Cuba. Institutional religion in Cuba is diverse and to a degree competitive. Institutional religions are also competitive with the spiritist religions. While most Cubans identify as Catholic, actual involvement in services and activities is relatively limited, estimated by the Catholic Church itself to 5 to 6%. Mainline Protestant denominations such as the Baptist, Methodist, Presbyterians, Episcopalians have also relatively limited participation at about 6%. Spiritist religions in some areas have higher levels of participation, but lack leaders who lead mass movements. Evangelical religions are also limited to a certain generally geographic space, as well as the issue of whether or not they are licensed by the government. Hence, religions in Cuba today are not likely to play critical roles in any transformation that may occur in Cuba in the near future. Thank you. Now our next speaker.
Thank you so much, Margaret. Now we have Maha. Welcome.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. I'm happy to be here and be part of this panel. And I want to thank Petra, especially for inviting me to participate. So the title of my talk is How White Men Became the Public Face of Afro-Cuban Religions in Cuba. So this presentation is a meditation on the changing religious landscape of Santeria in Cuba since Cuba's shift to the secular phase in 1990 and the institutionalization of Afro-Cuban religions. While this shift allowed for the quote-unquote normalization of Afro-Cuban religions that began to thrive openly inside and outside Cuba, it has not necessarily benefited Afro-Cuban practitioners. White men have become the dominant public face of the Yoruba religions, as Afro-Cubans, men and women, found themselves unable to compete in a tourist economy in which whiteness was privileged and where their religious practices were marketed and engaged as a commodity. So the Communist Party in Cuba lifted its prohibition against religious believers in 1991. The constitution was reformed the following year, declaring Cuba a secular state instead of atheist. Since then, Santeria has been experiencing a moment of revitalization. So this presentation, the result of many visits to Cuba over the years, is a meditation on the religious landscape as shaped by the late 20th century and early 21st century's economic and political changes in Cuba, including the initial collapse of the Soviet bloc, the economic crisis, a relentless US trade embargo, and an encroaching free market economy, and the changing relationship with the US during the presidency of President Barack Obama. This included the opening of the US embassy and the easing of business and travel restrictions. And so this research was conducted during that period, right, and ended with sort of basically the presidency of President Obama. So these changes have produced new racial dynamics that have obscured the historical legacy of Cuban Santeria, but they also contributed to the rise of new religious voices who are challenging the commercialization that has plagued the religion since the 1990s. So the history of Africana religions in Cuba has been an unstable one, marked by marginalization, stigmatization, and exploitation. During the years of the Republic, from 1902 to 1959, Afro-Cuban religious practices were criminalized and deemed dangerous. Many Cuban historians, including Fernando Ortiz, for instance, describe the police prosecution of African-derived practices in Cuba during the years of the Republic in his work. The subsequent socialist state from 1959 onwards discouraged any expression of religiosity until 1990, with the shift to the secular phase, as I mentioned before. A year later, in 1991, the First World Congress of Yoruba religions took place in the presence of the Communist Party and government officials, marking the beginning of public forums on Afro-Cuban religions in Cuba. So this was a very significant moment. So the normalization of Afro-Cuban religions did not particularly benefit Afro-Cuban practitioners. The structural inequalities of the early years of the revolution became more pronounced. The new economic policies, with tourism at the heart of the economic recovery plan, provoked new patterns of social mobility. Cuba turned into a mecca both for tourists and the Cuban diaspora who returned to Cuba for initiations because of US sanitary regulations. The cost of ceremonies skyrocketed, as well as the prices of initiation. Afro-Cubans found themselves at a disadvantage and unable to compete in a liberalized tourist economy that privileges whiteness. So this normalization, or the commodification of Afro-Cuban religions and cultures in the 1990s, eliminated to a large extent the stigma associated with these belief systems, but it was also a moment when the secrets, or what believers called the mysteries of santería, became compromised. The religion became institutionalized as folklore to a growing population of tourists who provided the main source of revenue for the island. At a national level, the mainstreaming of Afro-Cuban religions marks a shift in the way Cubans began to conceive of their racial identity. President Fidel Castro then declared Cubans an Afro-Latin people, and santería became the religion of the nation, regardless of race or cultural heritage. So Cubans often use a phrase derived from a poem by the leading Afro-Cuban poet, Nicolas Guillen, and the poem is called Son Número 6. The saying goes, El que no tiene de Congo, tiene de Carabalí, implying that all Cubans have African ancestors. So while on the surface, this statement optimistically challenges the myth of racial purity and the false binary of Black versus white prevalent in the US racial discourse, it also silences any meaningful conversations about systemic racism and cultural appropriation. So the commodification of santería in Havana, which my main sort of the place where I was doing my work was mainly in Havana. So the commodification of santería in that region, which led to the explosion in the number of white babalaos or santería priests who belonged to the order of Ifa, also reinforced the marginalization of women religious practitioners. So santería contains two orders. For those of you who are not familiar with the religion, the order of Ocha and the order of Ifa. So each has its oracular specificity. The first, Ocha, is heterogeneous and inclusive. And the second, Ifa, is strictly male-centered, heterosexual, and exclusive. So the Ifa started to expand in Cuba in early 20th century, specifically between 1915 and 1920, and excluded women from its divination system. This exclusion only sharpened in the decade of the 90s, with the Ifa reaching the heights of its popularity and white babalaos becoming the public face of the religion. So this shift in the racial genealogy of the religion is not surprising, considering that racial prejudices still prevail. As in many parts of the Caribbean, whiteness is still associated with authority and privilege in the public domain. Tourists to Cuba, as well as the Cuban diaspora, mostly white, are more likely to consult white than Black babalaos. Henry Herrera, an Afro-Cuban santero, explained this, and I quote from him: "This could simply be a matter of convenience. People run in the same social circles, and white Cubans who come to Cuba for initiations are more likely to go to babalaos who are in their same white social circles." This is in addition to the fact that whites in Cuba are in general more economically privileged, and as a result, white babalaos are able to navigate the new religious market with more ease. Significantly, the majority of white Cuban babalaos who were initiated in the 1990s in Havana, when the secrets of their religion became accessible to whites, have Afro-Cuban godparents, those who initiated them. But the majority of their godchildren, those they initiate, are white, which is telling, as it sheds more light on these changing racial dynamics. So it is possible now to find in Havana religious houses where all members are white. This change is even more noticeable in Miami, where there is a large population of white Cubans catered to exclusively by white babalaos. So many Afro-Cuban babalaos, especially those who stayed true to their faith in the early years of the revolution, when public religious worship was prohibited, view the growing number of white babalaos with suspicion. This is not because they believe the latter are not prone to Ifa priesthood or to being a babalao, especially considering that many Afro-Cuban babalaos, particularly in poor neighborhoods, have white godchildren. Victor Betancourt, a well-known Afro-Cuban babalao residing in Old Havana, and who, like many Afro-Cubans, promotes a discourse of unity, is keen on making a semantic distinction between whites with a capital W and whites with a small w. I'm translating here. So he sees that many whites with a capital W are simply exploiting the current situation for economic gains. He states, and I quote, "Those of us who are insiders to the religion can see that these white babalaos are not religious, that they don't have religious feelings and they don't have the faith. They don't believe in our deities, they don't believe in our ancestors because they still have racism in their hearts." So Afro-Cubans who were not willing to give up their beliefs during the 3 decades of atheism in Cuba paid a high price and carry bitter memories of being denied educational opportunities, jobs, and housing by the Communist Party because of their religion. As a result, many still live in poor, dilapidated neighborhoods of Old Havana. With the commodification of santería, it is white babalaos who can afford mobility, especially to places like Mexico and the US. And they are the ones benefiting from the waves of visitors flooding Havana from Europe, Mexico, Canada, and the US for initiations and religious consultations that are extremely costly. So since the 1990s, prices have been rising, not just for the goods needed for the religious ceremonies, but initiation fees have also skyrocketed. There are babalaos who make more than $1,000 per week when the monthly salary for the average Cuban is about $30, $25 to $40. So these changes in the racial landscape of the religion are reinforced by a new racial discourse that lends legitimacy to white priesthood or to the sort of babalaos. The idea that white babalaos are better informed about santería prevails. According to some, being aware that they were not raised in the religion, white Cubans work harder to expand their religious knowledge, right? So this is sort of the argument. This argument, while it asserts the authority of whiteness, conveniently dismisses the knowledge of Afro-Cuban babalaos, who, according to many whites, might have inherited a Yoruba culture and folklore, but have none of the in-depth intellectual knowledge. I want to know how I'm doing with the time. Tanya?
Yeah, you have a few minutes, yeah.
Okay, all
You
right.
have a few minutes, thanks.
Many Cubans express their preoccupation with the clandestine and excessive styles in which religious rituals are conducted. Santería doesn't subscribe to a specific dogma. This leads many who don't have an in-depth knowledge of the religion to claim priesthood and adopt extravagant practices purely for economic gains. The animal sacrifice ceremonies are exaggerated, and the demands of some babalaos can be extreme. The Cuban reggaeton group Cola Loca, and please, if you get the chance, go and check them out in YouTube. They have a video called La Estafa del Babalao, which is a very humorous and interesting video. So they provide a poignant social commentary on the exploitative demands of some babalaos in their song, which is called La Estafa del Babalao, or the deception of the Babalao, or the Ifa priest. The song is a satire and mocks the excessive demands of a priest when visited by a devotee who was struck by a stream of bad luck. To remove the curse, the priest asks for 5 hens, a can of gasoline, tangerines, chicken feed, duck eggs, a phone card, a painting of the Mona Lisa, a baby turtle, a bald frog, $600 bills, etc., etc. So when the man's situation, the guy who goes to see the babalao, when his situation doesn't improve and he returns to the babalao tells him that basically this is certainly was not his fault. And sort of the song ends with a tongue-in-cheek statement: one has to respect the babalaos. So the excess with which white babalaos approach the religion is an attempt to conceal an enormous theological gap. Because of the lack of a principal dogma, many priests do not take the trouble of learning in depth about the meaning of each ritual. Instead, animal sacrifice becomes the answer to a multitude of issues. The more complex one's problems are, the more animals is required to sacrifice. This trivialization of the religion is perpetuated and transferred to devotees who, having paid such a high price for the ceremony, did not feel the need to be spiritually devoted to the faith. Those who object to the centrality of animal sacrifice argue that under slavery, Afro-Cubans did not sacrifice animals simply because they couldn't afford them, and yet they succeeded in preserving their faith. So I want to end by saying that in face of all this excessiveness, right, there is also a movement that challenges the excessiveness by basically questioning some of these rituals and providing alternative ways of preserving this tradition without sort of this excess in the religion. There are some who do not subscribe to animal sacrifice, or they call it sort of initiation without blood. So that's one of the movements in Cuba. There is another movement that questions the offerings to the deities or to the spirits, right? So like you see sort of bows going in the water and food being thrown in the water, in the ocean or the river as an offering. So some babalaos are saying, let's make that a symbolic act. We don't have to be throwing food physically in the river or in the ocean, that we can actually use that food to feed the community. So this is, I'm concluding, for many Afro-Cuban practitioners of Santería and their religious communities, the religion provides an alternative space independent from the state, where they can assert autonomy. So despite all these problems, I do not want to undermine the importance of this religion in people's lives, especially in the lives of Afro-Cubans for whom this religion provides autonomy. So despite the fact that they have not been the main actors in the way the religion has been interpreted, they have continued to carve an autonomous space for themselves. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maha, for this wonderful presentation. Now we have Petra, the curator of this event and who put together this event. Thank you so much, Petra.
Thank you. I will also share a PowerPoint that has the key points I would like to communicate. Just give me a second to share it. You should be able to see the PowerPoint now. Yes. So good afternoon, and thank you for the wonderful papers so far. To continue this discussion started by Margaret and Maha, my contribution today emerges from the perspective on Catholic charity, aging, and gendered experience in contemporary Cuba. I should say that this is part of a forthcoming book. And in this paper, I take a part of the article and I focus on senior citizens, the elderly, the women in particular, as a specific social group in Cuba, because I think that the nexus of aging, civil society, and religion is one warranting more attention in scholarship. Because as it is, Cuba has one of the oldest populations in Latin America. Numerous scholars have discussed the accelerating aging process that characterizes contemporary Cuban society and has significant implications for future development from the perspectives of state economy, social justice, and individual well-being. Closely related to the increasing amount of the oldest cohorts of the population is the increasing number of single-person households among them. Information provided by a national survey on aging from 2017 states that 41.6% of the elderly in Cuba live without a partner. This is where religion comes in as a specific dimension of social networks, experiences of kinship, and structures of care. With its transnational and institutional span, the Catholic Church in Cuba is both an established actor of non-governmental charity and also an emerging actor in the area of care for the elderly. Even though the visions of ideal social ethics and political ideology have differed significantly, the Catholic Church and the Cuban state have presented service to the people as a core of social and socio-political ethos, legitimizing their actions. Although charities worldwide operate based on the Catholic faith and socio-ethical values, they serve religious and secular constituents, providing services regardless of religious affiliation and creed. The elderly in Cuba receiving food or medical aid, services of companionship and care, or otherwise attending the religious community are not subject to an estimation of their religious background. However, as the number of individuals in need and requesting such aid has constantly increased, the charities nowadays consider and admit individuals to the programs on a selective basis, determining the designated assistance based on the need and the available resources. As the most vulnerable groups in Cuban society, such as the elderly, have been at the center of Catholic charitable programs since their start in the early 1990s. In contemporary Cuba, Catholic services that focus on material and spiritual aid to vulnerable groups are organized through specific charitable institutions such as Caritas, religious orders specializing in charitable work, and national projects which often emerge as bottom-up initiatives. Additionally, each diocese engages in charity as parts of its local mission. Local Catholic communities provide charity through numerous programs, missions, and operations. And in general, these services are intended for the most vulnerable social groups, among them the elderly, the disabled, those living without sufficient income or housing, and those suffering from mental illnesses or homelessness. As the COVID-19 pandemic and the accelerating economic and social crisis have increased the need for these type of services, local Catholic communities have responded by developing new programs and initiatives that attempt to provide both material and social aid to those most severely impacted by the current circumstances. The number of seniors living alone in Cuba has increased in the 21st century, as I mentioned. It is noteworthy that they are predominantly women, and most depend on their personal finances, such as their pension and savings in day-to-day life, with limited or no access to sources of external income. The proportion of widows is significant in the group over 75. And as has been shown in scholarship, the lack of domestic relationships contributes significantly to the feelings of loneliness and sadness, as well as the overall mental health of the elderly living alone. In such circumstances, different social networks, communities, and kinship encounters can play an essential role in sustaining structured daily life and interpersonal relations as part of a socially and physically active lifestyle, as well as a meaningful aging process. Of course, an issue closely related to the Cuban population's aging is the migration of young adults from the island. As the ones opting for migration have typically been expected to assume a role of domestic caregiving to the family's senior members. This development changes not only the demographics, but also the patterns of care on the island. Since the number of individuals providing domestic care for their immediate family has decreased, the aging poses a challenge of organizing alternative forms of care outside the immediate family and the domestic sphere. The Catholic Church in Cuba acknowledges and addresses the phenomenon by facilitating discourses on the nexus of migration, aging, and the crisis of care. While the Church underscores migration as a free choice of individuals, it also discusses the implications of it to the elderly that remain on the island. And so in recent years, several Catholic programs have targeted the young adults with services that emphasize staying on the island, not only as one of the solutions to the crisis of care, but also as a viable choice from the perspective of an individual's educational and professional development. These services, such as education, courses, and training in entrepreneurship, are vital for young adults fostering professional aspirations. And so by extending the horizon of opportunities on the island, the availability of this type of services becomes crucial also from the perspective of care and security for the elderly. And at the same time, these projects present religiously motivated charity and care as a means to fulfill one's moral commitment to society and to the preceding generations of Cubans. Another critical junction of Catholicism and aging in Cuba emerges from the gendered nature of both aging and representation in local Catholic communities. Women appear as the predominant social group both in Catholic activities and among the elderly in the most vulnerable positions. As has been shown in scholarship, aging is a critically gendered experience, influenced by the multiplicity of social roles and expectations appointed to people according to their gender, as well as the gendered nature of personal health, life trajectories, and a sense of agency. Catholicism in Cuba and the local Catholic communities have typically placed senior citizens and women in key positions of agency and autonomy as lay people in their communities and in the domestic space. A typical attendee of Sunday Mass is an elderly woman entering the church building alone or with a group of friends of the same age group and gender. In the socialist period, as the visibility of religious institutions in the public sphere declined significantly, grandmothers and other senior female family members often assumed the main responsibility for transferring religious beliefs and values to the younger generations. In local communities, they still often serve as volunteers who exercise considerable autonomy in the day-to-day functions, such as taking care of the church building, preparing it for the mass, organizing devotional activities without priests or other types of religious specialists present. And in addition, they also collaborate with the clergy and religious orders in charity outreach programs toward the broader community or the neighborhood. And similarly, elderly women both participate in charitable programs as volunteers and receive material aid from such programs. This reflects an essential idea of Catholic charity, the egalitarian idea that both the providers and recipients of religious charity belong to the same community as religious subjects, and that these roles may become reversed at another time. Another relevant consideration is that religious communities typically value tradition and as such appoint senior citizens to positions of respect and authority within the community. For the Catholic communities, it is typical to include elderly also in the contemporary current decision-making processes related to the organization of the community and also articulating its values and mission. Such perspective suggests that religious communities consider old age an abundant source of knowledge and experience, attempting to bring the elderly in dialogue with the younger members of the community. And as such, these programs and activities organized by Catholic communities for all of their members, not targeting specific age groups, also serve as spaces of cross-generational exchange. For example, the Sunday Mass, the very core of Catholic devotional practices, brings the senior citizens into contact with not only their peers, but other generations attending the congregation as well. This exchange is particularly relevant in relation to the fact that religious traditions and beliefs often connect with the existential questions related to old age, sense of mortality, and the decline of vitality at the end of life, providing individuals with concepts and frameworks for processing such topics from distinctively religious perspectives. So to sum and to conclude, the social space and charitable action of religion functions as a means to construct meanings related to aging, kinship, and care, not only on spiritual and existential, but also on a social level. In the framework of civil society and its various networks, the increasing need for charitable services in Cuba can increase the popularity of religiously motivated attachment and meaning-making. As such, charity functions as a vehicle of Catholic engagement in civil society. It supports the evangelizing mission of the Church, and that in turn could provide the Church with more social influence and help the Church expand its domain beyond spirituality and towards more active socio-ethical engagement in civil society. I will conclude with that. Looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Petra. We have now Mabel. I think you speak in Spanish.
Sí.
So give a second for the people to switch on the translation. Welcome. Bienvenida.
Gracias. Bueno, mi texto se llama
Text or my presentation is called Solidarity in the Margins. Christ loves my color. So it's a bit has to do with what was just presented about the different projects regarding care programs. And, you know, in Cuba, we call it proyectos de cuido, that's how we call them. So I'm going to talk about different episodes of how COVID in summer 2021 had some effects, and also talk about the work of a church, which is called Iglesia de la Comunidad Metropolitana, whose main components are young Christian people that also identify in the LGBTQ plus community. So these reside among different Cuban official channels, but this invisibility compensates in different associations that identify face-to-face as digital. Social media are communicational tools, that work so that among them they could send food and medicine, but also help out with many of the lackings that the Cuban regime submits into people with daily violence. So this way of caring for the most vulnerable during the COVID-19 crisis in summer 2021 and their political crisis as territories in social aspects in that same period. That's why today I want to talk about an organized group of this community of Christian youngs in the Comunidad Metropolitana, that these are young Christians that identify with the LGBTQ plus community. So they reside in Matanzas and La Habana, and there were those that in summer 2021, I mean, they have so many projects, but I mean, I don't have the time to talk about them because they really have an intense work that continues and works in many ways, but they organized in real time and direct delivery. That means without the intervention of institutions or government organizations of humanitarian aid that reaches with food and medicine from diverse places around the world. So the presentation will explore then why this productivity of this intersection work and why they put their bodies in function with their needs. So, there's simultaneous and spontaneous actors within civil society in Cuba that it's transnational and responds to the calling that they had in the first July 2021. They had two hashtags, SOS Cuba and hashtag SOS Matanza. So the crisis that was a health crisis that because of COVID and many other chronic and other diseases, and there's a precarity of medicine and medical goods, and there's an incapacity of a state that doesn't only produce the minimum for well-being, but it cannot, whatever they have, they spend it in the very, broken tourism industry. So they have had a survival answer to with various artists, professionals, and different Christian communities that have decided to really act and protest, like in San Isidro in 27N. But really to talk, about artists and professionals that really gathered, they dedicated to gather, catalog, and give all the possible humanitarian help that they can get. And today I will present briefly some of these solidarity and caring or care program projects that have terminated by being interconnected among each other with a certain Cuban diaspora. So I'll talk about the concrete actions in July 2021 and how this worked for how there's a reading, but also a looking towards a place, being this other, a project of transnation that appears so visibly in the media, as a legitimate, movement for these communities and digital networks. So although it was critically subversive during this Cuban crisis, it seems ethereal, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, to the real thing, young people that cannot sleep, from Florida to the Atlantic, by helping their co-terrants on the subtly infrastructures that were perceived as persecuted. These groups are young people, women, and members of the LGBTQ Christian community that have been rescuing a vulnerable, infected, aged, and dying population. So if I consider important to these things, age, gender, sexuality, and religiousness, I want to focus, because this is my argument, it weaves between the margins, but also with these variables, it gives the possibility of Cuba as an amorphous transnation and every more possible to have different ideological contexts and content that is polarized and fixed. So just to remember about the SARS-CoV-19 era, which was clear and speedy, whilst from the US and Mexico, the things that came from Russia and their airlines, Azur Air, Aeroflot, Icar, Norwind, and Royal Flight, weekly brought thousands of Russian tourists that were installed in Varadero, Cayo Coco, where services provided were given by Cuban residents, right? Cubans that then marched to their homes and involuntarily produced more than 3,000 contagions by day, and then 6,000, 8,000, and by the August 22, they became the record of 48,487 cases confirmed of COVID-19. So this is where the Iglesia de la Comunidad Metropolitana community, led by Elaine Salergui in Givi Cruz, decided to organize projects to help them parallelly. So for all these elderly people living alone, they gave them food, and then the Pact of Medicine together with the theater group De Portazo. This second group that they're not necessarily Christian or they don't identify, I mean, it's constituted by at least 8 men that identify as as gay, and their show declares a commitment from this theatrical ambience, for Cuban LGBTQ minority. So El Portazo and ICM worked together hand in hand during the crisis in the summer of 2021, to work tirelessly to bring, the medicine needed for all the COVID patients. Back to the Church of Community of Comunidad Metropolitana in Cuba, it's worth mentioning that everything was part of their initial vision and how it is established in their documents. So this is the first Cuban religious center with radically inclusive environment, right? So people from the LGBTQ plus society is welcome. So the ICM has as a mission to liberate the ties of the imposed violence by spiritual intimidation, and is focused on the well-being and rights of the LGBTIQ plus people. So also, the faith declaration of the ICM formed part of different campaigns that have been really active for the new family code that was approved in September 2022. And the names of the campaign, there are actually 2 campaigns. The first one is Todos los derechos para todas las familias, mi familia es muy original. And the second, Cristo ama mis colores, no? Christ loves my colors. So that's why this is their mission and their vision, right? So for the vision, following as example Jesus and with the power of the Spirit, we want to be a community that is transforming and demands justice for the world, developing actions and strategies that promote respect, equality, love, and the dignity of the human being, especially, and this is emphasizing the most vulnerable, by considering that diversity when it comes to gender, race, creed, religion, culture, capacities, sexual orientation, or gender identity, and the freedom to express it is a divine gift and a human fundamental right. That's their vision. And now for their mission, to proclaim and practice a spirituality based on the liberated evangelios of Jesus Christ, and boosting a spiritual growth where they have faith for justice, compassion, love, and integrate sexuality and spirituality as a divine gift, and also being a community that recognizes lesbians, gay, bisexuals, transgenders, transvestites, and transsexuals in the life of the church, and also of pastoral ministry, and also different ministries. Also in the Cuban context, with our understanding as an activist church, highlighting activist church of the Comunidad Metropolitana in Cuba. So those are their arguments. So that's the vision and the mission. Everything I've just said was sadly forced by the crisis of COVID-19, but they didn't stop talking about how the story of a country that only half a century before, with the episode of UMAP, together of the forced work camps for Christians and for gay Christians. And, the same one was depurating, all the neighborhoods of the side of the island by forcing homosexuals and Christians to be expelled from the island. So they answered to their inclusive policies of CENESEX, the Centro Nacional para la Educación Sexual, led by Mariela Castro, and their Office of Attention for Religious Matters in the Comité Central. They positioned themselves next to the most vulnerable in civil society at the margin of their religious practices or spiritualities. In other words, they're making an emphasis in the urgency of moving forward with humanitarian agendas. And here the ideology would include also the Christian. The mission and vision of ICM denounces laterally that Cuba is a country where it's urgent to help to reach impoverished communities that are historically marginalized, and not only for all those actors of the church, but also transnational care programs across the island. So going back to summer 2021, where ICM and the group of El Portazo, the theater group, received in Las Matanzas a ton of medicine that arrived through Cuba, through Miami, Madrid, La Habana, and then arrived to Matanzas. Also, another group in Madrid that had been working, gathering, goods, sent half a ton of drugs to ICM and El Portazo. Everything with 6 weeks where an average of 96 Cubans would die in each one of them. So I'm talking just about July 8th until August 25th. So in summary, 1.5 tons of medicine arrived to Matanzas City during the crisis, thanks to this non-institutionalized management of Cubans in the diaspora. So with all these medicines were putting in hands of the Christian church that was helping for equality and a radical and inclusive, aspect that with bikes and electrical bikes, they were reaching houses of the sick and elderly and isolated to give them help. I want to end my presentation with a slide that this is just an idea of what happened that summer and that what keeps happening with an intensity. In July 26, 2021, and I was there, in El Portazo, Matanzas, 3 bags with 150 pounds of medicines came from Miami and Madrid. That's where the actors of this theater and members of the ICM were dividing them. But someone announced on social media that day, new medicine were going to come in and that they were going to be shared at the theater. It was July 26th, and that theater was located exactly in the square of the city of Matanzas that ironically is called Park of Freedom. It was July 26th, and only 15 days before, the island that was lacking medicine, that was hungry and dying, had come to ask for freedom. But the Square of Freedom was completely empty. We could only hear a recording of an old Silvio Rodríguez song, La Nueva Escuela, or Canción Urgente a Nicaragua. Also, they were convoking in a microphone for revolutionaries of the present. The square was empty, but the theater in the corner was full. It was completely full. People shouting, I need Tylenol, my sister is dying, I need antibiotics, help me, azithromycin, azithromycin, my kid has fever, what should I do? And outside, it was Silvio saying, I'm dying as I lived in his song, and an elderly person giving, I'm dying, I have the virus, but give something to my wife, she's also dying. Inside, young and people were showing that the people of Cuba in its pain feels hurt and has been able to have, it was July 26, 2021, when between shouts in the theater, in the Square of Freedom, agents of security of the state arrived and said that because of epidemiological reasons, the theater had to close, and they closed it, and people had to go home crying. A group of average 35-year-old Christian, homosexual in their majority, although not everyone, women, dedicated the next few hours and days to really ride their bikes, ride their motorcycles, anything they could to take medicines to the sick. Medicines that, the time is out, but they really went without caring about who was the sick person. So they really helped their community. Thank you.
Presentación tan emotiva. Well, thank you so much to all the presenters. They have been amazing analysis and data that have been shared today. Before we open to the question of the public, I want to ask some sort of general question for all of you. And it seems that in every presentation there is a little bit of tension or a little bit of let's say competition between the regime and the initiative from either the church or civic society. So I wanted to, since we also know that in Cuba it is forbidden to legalize any organization other than the ones the state have created. I wanted to ask all of you, how do you see possible to grow these projects with the situation they are being elaborated from, and for example, in the case of Margaret, for example, how do you think civic society can arrive to a situation in which they can talk face to face to other governments or to similar institutions that are recognized in other countries, therefore having a more I don't know, legitimacy or you know, having a conversation with people at their same level, even if they are not being legalized? Or, for example, Maha, what do you think about the tension that exists between these two Afro-Cuban houses, let's call it, the official one, that give the letter of the year, the prediction for the year that many people think they're being elaborated by the regime, versus the one that are independent? How do you think this could be solution or dealt with in the future, since they cannot be recognized? There is only one that is recognized, which is the official one. And a little bit the same for Petra and Mabel. I think, how can you see, for example, a situation in which the efforts being done by civic society are not reduced to be quote unquote marginalized or quote unquote penalized, or in the best of the cases seen as a personal response instead of an institutional response from civic society or the church? I don't know if that can...
Can I make an attempt to respond?
Thank you.
Normally in Cuba, as I mentioned earlier, all associations are required to be licensed, including religious associations. You have a wide diversity of religious groups, institutional churches, prayer groups, home churches, etc., that opt in some cases to apply for a license and others not to. For example, the Apostolic Church, which is a evangelical group, has not applied for a license. In most cases, many prayer groups don't feel it's necessary, etc. Applying to the government for some sort of legal status is traditional in virtually every country in the world. And you also have a high degree, depending on the country, of facilitating such registering or licensing or rejecting it. In Cuba, you will find that certain groups that the government is not happy with. For example, such as the Apostolic Church, because it emphasizes homeschooling, they tend not to be receiving their licenses. The Catholic Church, the mainline Protestant denominations, the Baptists and the Episcopalians and Methodists, etc., do generally become licensed. So you have a very high degree of diversity amongst the various religious groups. You also have a high degree of diversity between the religious groups and the access they have to senior government officials, in part because of its historical institutional strength in Cuba. You have had the Catholic Church actually being given a certain degree of preferential treatment, certainly as compared to the Afro-Cuban religions. They have had historically, and particularly under Cardinal Ortega and Raul Castro, a degree of communication on a regular basis, which did facilitate the accomplishment of some, but not all, of the Catholic agenda items. For example, the desire of the Catholic Church, particularly in the aftermath of the visit of John Paul II, to have greater access to the public media, was not fulfilled by the government. And this led to the Archdiocese of Havana taking advantage of their own resources, and particularly their access to international resources, to establish publications such as Espacio Laical and others. And you have, however, the difference in terms of prioritization. Cardinal Ortega emphasized a more political agenda than the current Archbishop of Havana, who emphasizes more the pastoral work of parishes, and to a lesser extent, attention to a dialogue with the national government. So you have had various dioceses and parishes emphasizing many of the types of programs, caregiving, provision of medical supplies, provision of foodstuffs, etc. I should mention there is one group that hasn't been mentioned, and that is the Jewish community in Cuba. The Jewish community in Cuba, which numbers, according to the US government, approximately 1,200, it's probably larger than that, has been very active in providing foodstuffs and medical supplies to the elderly within Cuba. And these material donations generally come from the United States as well as the rest of Latin America. Within the religious community, and I'm going to conclude with this, there is still not a tremendously strong level of trust between the Catholic Church and, for example, the Afro-Cuban religious groups. There is not a high degree of cooperation between the Catholic Church and the evangelical churches, like the Assembly of God, the Jehovah's Witnesses, and others. And this reduces the influence of religions in general with the government. And that is a disadvantage if you are building a consensual agenda for change within civil society in general. And it's also an advantage in communicating with the government.
I'll go ahead and answer the question as well that Tanya asked about tension, and sort of the example you gave about the letter of the year is a good example about this tension between sort of the government and practitioners of Afro-Cuban santería, or sort of the lived experience of the people. So I can tell you that no one really takes that letter seriously, right? The official letter that comes out of the association that's sponsored by the government, no one takes that letter seriously, which is sort of tells you in itself that there is a disconnect between how people see the religious traditions, the communities and the organizations they trust, and what sort of, the government tries to project or promote in how it represents these religious traditions. But I think the real tension here when it comes to Afro-Cuban religions is really a tension between the sort of how the religion is commercialized, right? Those who benefit from the commercialization of the religion against others who really want to preserve the religion for what it is and what it means to people, right? So ultimately, although I talk about the racial tension, the bigger sort of tension is the tension between those who are exploiting the religion and those who want to preserve the religion. So there is a lot of work being done to reform the religion at the moment. And mind you, when I say at the moment, I have not been back to Cuba since the pandemic, so I don't know how things have been since then. But what I can say is that before then, there were movements that were going back to what they call sort of the old ways, and also to the centrality of women to the religion, right? So one of the reasons the Babalaos have so much power is because it's a part of religion that's very exclusive and very male-centered. When we look at the history of these religious traditions, women were at the center of them. So for instance, there are attempts to reform the religion by going back to the old songs from the 70s and the 80s and dissecting them and looking at the rituals as they are sort of articulated through these songs. There is also the issue, of course, the fact that Babalaos have so much power and they are such sort of a heterosexual it's a very heterosexual branch of the religion, right? So you see, for instance, people from the LGBTQ community who are Babalaos, but these are Babalaos who were initiated before they came out, right? And so I think there's also this attempt to make IFA more inclusive. I don't know how long that's going to take because Babalaos in Cuba have a lot of power, but I think it's gradually changing.
Thank you so much. Petra?
Thank you for these answers or meditations. We have a lot of very interesting questions posted in the chat. I suspect that we will be able to go through all of the questions. But I will.
Before we go to a question, I don't know if Mabel wants to answer the question or prefer not to.
Maybe Mabel, you can answer with a follow-up from the chat. There is an additional question asking, what do you see as the main challenges the humanitarian projects face at the moment?
Okay, I'm gonna answer that one with actually another little anecdote. When that crisis happened in the summer of 2021, I was talking about these tons of meds that we were able to channel, through Madrid and actually get to Cuba, but there was so much that still stopped in Miami because we had no way to send it to Cuba. We are talking about maybe 2 more tons of meds. Okay, do you know how much time it took for us with the money in hand? Okay, we had the money, we collect the money also within the community. Do you know how long it took for us to have the Centro Martin Luther King in Havana to authorize that container of meds? to get to the people in Cuba? 10 months. We pay for the container, we ship the meds, but the authorization, the red tape, the bureaucracy, it took 10 months. When another 2 tons of meds got to Cuba, not most of them, but I'd say easily a third of them, being conservative, were already expired. So how can you work with a government that actually puts so much impediment, when the aid is coming from the from the exiles, from the community abroad? Because they do it on purpose, because when this guy in Canada, and I have no against the guy, I mean, it's not in Canada, but it's close to Canada, the Puentes de Amor guy, he's so close to the government that whenever he wants to ship, I don't know, some tons of milk, stuff like that, and they make a huge statement about it on the national TV, that milk got to Havana in a week, right? But since we, the people who are also critical to the government, just organize ourselves and send these shipments, they do everything in their power to delay it. And of course, that's why my presentation start talking about how the official news outlets never talked about us. And when I'm saying us, I'm not talking, of course, about me or my groups. I'm talking about whoever, in the exile gets organized and send this aid to Cuba. Of course, nobody does it for the credit, but it's frustrating to see how they are trying to avoid this new way of relations, because, Miami has this name for being so conservative, Republican, Trumper followers, whatever. It's a huge lie. Miami is packed with people who want to help, and Madrid and Mexico City. We are all over the world. So how can we fix this? We cannot. The government has to get involved. The government has to do their part. They really need to cut I don't want to say a bad word, cut the crap, and just allow us to do what we are entitled to do as part of the Cuban civil society, because we are Cubans. We feel very much, no matter how long we've been living abroad, most of the people who are sending meds to Cuba, who are giving money for us to send meds to Cuba, we feel so connected to the island and to the people in the island. And so for that question about how can we do, unfortunately, nothing. They are the ones, and what I say by they is the government, that have to really talk to us. We're willing to do it.
Thank you. There are many questions regarding the role of religions in civil society, and also the tensions regarding the role. We are reaching the end of our webinar here, and I want to conclude with one final question that sums up our papers and also most of the questions that have been posted. Thank you for all the questions. Would someone of you like to comment on the current development in Cuban legislation, and in terms of possible opportunities or advantages for civil society? Mabel, are you?
No, I'm sorry. I was hoping someone else go. But I'm sorry, could you say the question? Could you tell us the question again? I'm sorry.
Would you like to comment on the evolving legislation and its effect on civil society? And anyone can jump in.
Well, for the legislation, I mean the family code,
Among other things, yes.
Yes, but it was a bittersweet thing, since it happened at the same time when the penal code also passed, and nobody voted on that one. You know what I'm saying? Like for the family code, everybody had to go to referendum and vote, and it functions as una cortina de humo, right? To really hide the penal code that was, passing during the same frame of time, giving, high sentences to people just to post their opinion, just for posting their opinions on Facebook. So, of course, we, the LGBTQ community, were very happy about and many other people were very happy about the new family code. But as I said, it was bittersweet because it was used so much as a say diversion for what was really happening with the penal code. So that's the scenario we are dealing with. It's so challenging even to be in alliance with some of the new legislation when you're being used. That's the way I feel. I don't know if Tanya has something else on that.
We are now on the final minutes of the webinar, so I will thank all of you for the papers. Thank you all for the questions and comments. And then I will hand it over to Tanya to conclude.
Thank you, Petra, for putting together these amazing speakers and to bring these ideas into consideration for the webinar. I want to thank all of you, Margaret, Maha, Mabel, and you, Petra, but as well, I want to thank Jimena, who is the person behind making everything possible, Romy and translation, and Evelyn for assisting us today. Thank you so much, and we're looking forward to seeing the next webinar. Make sure to look at the website of Dr. Class. We have all of these events recorded and available online for you to look at them again and to think together with us about Cuba. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Petra. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Petra and Jimena.
Thank you, Tanya.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Petra.